Hello, my name is Jeffrey Pollock. I'm a student at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome, Italy, and this is a talk that I'll be giving tomorrow at the Marconi Institute for Creativity conference here in Cagliari, in Sardinia. So at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross, we have a 3-year project investigating creativity from an interdisciplinary perspective, and this is sort of one of the efforts and opportunities that we have to interact with people who study creativity. So we hope to cross paths with many of you very soon. So the idea of this talk is to kind of explore and introduce one possible notion of creativity, which would be creativity through form. And the idea of this would be a type of creativity that involves a certain process of maybe we could call ideation, idea designing, in which the mind grasps the essence or the nature or what Aristotle would call the form, the sort of abstract content of the ideas that are being combined. So let's jump in. First of all, why develop a philosophy of creativity? Well, you can think about definitions, right? There's ongoing efforts to kind of develop an ontology of the terms involved in creativity. And one of these kind of popular definitions is that creativity involves novelty, value, and agency. But each of these concepts is what we might call a deep concept. It's a concept that really gets at the core of a lot of the activity that we think as of being very kind of human. And so there's these questions of what counts as new, who determines value, how is agency defined, and how does that exert its influence upon the person who creates. And these are topics that are often talked about in metaphysics or in ethics or in anthropology. And these are philosophical questions. So obviously, chemistry, biology, physics have a lot to say about creativity, but there's a need to sort of integrate these within the holistic perspective of philosophy. Of course, what we're trying to do here is not to sort of propose exclusive terms or definitions, but rather contribute to this effort to have kind of a shared set of concepts, terminology that can open up new research questions. Now, I would call this perspective a sort of anti-reductionist perspective. That is, sometimes the conclusions of science are taken in a way that is, I would say, inherently philosophical. So there's this kind of famous quote by Francis Crick here, in which he basically says that we can explain joy's ambitions, identity, free will completely by the sort of biological or physical assembly of nerve cells and molecules. And whether or not we agree with that statement, that is actually a philosophical statement. And so it has its own kind of set of relevant data, methods, conclusions that are needed to kind of give it this broad or sort of irreducible perspective. Now, unfortunately, I won't have time to go into the details of this, but there are several studies of creativity, many that kind of take this perspective. Just a few, obviously, the perspective of Giovanni Corazza, who's organizing the conference with the MIC Institute. Um, there's work on creativity and culture. There's also work on sort of agency, virtue, and I would say that these works kind of take this broader perspective on kind of meaning and value. Now, in this study, I'm going to use Aristotle. Okay, so why go back to ancient Greece to talk about a type of creativity? Well, Aristotle made some of his biggest contributions in change, art, ethics, and virtue, which are terms that have a lot to do with creativity. If creativity requires innovation, innovation is the generation of something new. There's also a lot of kind of contemporary interest in Aristotle from this branch of philosophy called neo-Aristotelianism or something like that, which are kind of people originally coming from analytic philosophy who are also interested in doing philosophy of science, and they find some ideas from Aristotle useful. So this is kind of the key philosophical background of this talk. which is that Aristotle thinks that objects in nature need to be understood as, you could say, multifaceted or multidimensional rather. So he thinks, yes, they do have their own chemical structure. We can talk about the atoms within, a dog or a horse or a tree or whatever. But they also have certain principles of unity. And then those objects are dynamic, so they act upon the outside world, and they at all times are performing some function or they have some value. And so Aristotle thinks you really need all three or four of these perspectives to understand really what a dog or a horse or a tree is. And these three things, loosely, he calls, loosely because these three words are not exactly equivalent, but for the purpose of this talk they are, he calls the essence or the form of the nature of an object. And they determine different kinds of objects. So one possibility is that you could think of these sort of different kinds of objects determined by essences as a requirement for sort of the deepest sense of creativity. This might have something to do with a perspective that Derricks calls kind of type 1 or type 2 creativity. So type 1 has to do with exploiting new dynamics of kind of existing phenomena. Type 2 is really generating a new sort of kind of thing, even though, of course, that's not exactly the language that's used in that article. But I think the perspective is related. And perhaps with Aristotle, we could use that kind of language of essence to explore, okay, what does it really mean to generate a new kind of thing? So just to go a little bit deeper in that idea of essence, well, Aristotle has a whole bunch of study on this, and so he distinguishes between novelties that are essential and novelties that are accidental. So just to throw a little bit of humor in the middle of the talk, consider a very curious kind of object, which is, you see on the left here, a 200-kilogram cow wearing a sweater. Okay, so the essence of what we have here is a cow. These other characters, weighing 200 kilograms or wearing a sweater are what Aristotle would call accidents. Um, and then he even has kind of a whole list of different accidents, quality, relation, time, place, position, that perhaps could help us to think about when we're developing kind of new technologies, what is kind of an accidental change and what is an essential change. Now, by definition, essence and accidents in Aristotle apply, first of all, to natural realities, to things that we find in nature. So some work is kind of necessary to extend this to artificial systems like a car or a heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system. So I'm going to kind of skip over the details here, but just know that we kind of need some of that neo-Aristotelianism to extend the idea of essence to an artificial system. Okay, so another thing useful in Aristotle is his concept of techne in Greek. Now, techne also often gets translated into English as art, or you could think technique. And by art, he means actually not just a piece of art, but the capacity, like the artistic capacity to generate art. And so Aristotle studies this, and he has kind of a rich concept of techne. So we could say it's the capacity of an agent to understand and produce artificial systems in order to carry out some function. So in other words, techne is sort of the generation of a new artificial essence. And one thing that's really important here is that that essence is understood. So Aristotle thinks that the agent who creates should be able to sort of manipulate these abstract ideas or forms or natures or essence, modify them, and combine them. He says that in the use of techne, one part is called thinking and the other part is called making. So there's a real process of, perhaps we call it ideation, going on here. Now, for Aristotle, this type of thinking and reasoning is unique to humans because he thinks that only organisms with a rational intellect can grasp these essences or forms of natures that we've been talking about. Now, this could be a little abstract. I think one way to kind of help us to get into what that really means is to look at kind of a more modern take on this. Arnold Gehlen has this idea of a German word that I'm not even going to try to pronounce, but which means basically liberation or exoneration. And he says that humans explore our environments through our senses. We kind of notice that the objects around us can be manipulated with different actions. We give terms to those manipulations through language, and then we share those terms with other people through communication. And as we do this, we kind of remove ourselves step by step from the concrete object to the sort of universal idea or abstract idea, and that gets us, although he doesn't, I think, use these terms, to the kind of essence, form, or nature. And he thinks that this is something really proper to human behavior, even though he has sort of a very biological perspective on anthropology. So I want to call the type of creativity in which an agent generates through these forms, essence, natures, manipulating them and combining them, I want to call that formal creativity. Now, of course, I'm not trying to say that all creativity has to be like this. I think was recently watching one of these documentaries on nature. There are other talks in the conference on that. It's obvious that animals have a certain very impressive type of creativity. I also often use AI, large language models, things like that, and those do very new, kind of exciting things. There's some type of creativity, I think, going on there. In fact, those different agents might even produce a product which could be equivalent to that produced by a human being using this combination of essences, etc. So I would say that that product could be called material creativity, but only an agent who actually grasps these type of essences would be defined as using formal creativity. Now, just a brief mention, obviously another type of, kind of characteristic usually required of creativity is that it involved agency. And agency kind of sounds to us like maybe a certain sort of heightened type of agency would be free will. Uh, and Aristotle doesn't have a discussion of free will, but he does think that the agency involved in techne is one that knows the ends for which something is designed. And so this is what people after Aristotle will call free will. And so again, if creativity and techne require free will, formal creativity, I should say, formal creativity, then they are, Aristotle would say, sort of uniquely human. Again, there might be creation of almost the same product, which would be called material creativity if the agent doesn't have the end in mind. So I'll leave you kind of with this last slide, which it's a little bit verbose because this is still very much a work in project, very much looking for feedback. But this slide explains that a complete definition of formal creativity would be the production of a new system, kind of a new artificial essence, in order to fulfill some function through the use of reason, which grasps ideas in their essence and assigns this value or function. Of course, there are other some kind of distinctions, little c, big C, creativity. These, I think, are a little bit more about kind of the final product that's made. So this is very much the creativity I'm trying to define is based on sort of the mental process, which of course also has exterior manifestations. There's some future work, which for now I'll skip over. And interesting discussion could be held about kind of the historical philosophical critiques of essence, form, nature over time. And we should say that actually creativity goes beyond what Aristotle describes as techne, because he thinks that someone who uses techne doesn't necessarily have to design a novel object. He should or she should sort of have a grasp of the whole function and maybe be able to even make changes in that design, but does not necessarily have to generate something new. So probably creativity goes even beyond that, and of course it's a term that is very much posterior to Aristotle. So thank you for your attention and hope to interact with many of you soon.